In this brief podcast, I'll take a look here at the Gospels as biographies. So, a couple of things as we get into understanding the genre of the Gospels. The titles that we have in our Gospels, like the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, and these titles, Evangelion kata Markon, for example, Gospel according to Mark, were given to the Gospels in the second and third centuries, so a little bit later than when they were actually written. That's not to say that these Gospels may not have been circulated with some kind of designation that would have been shared by those who were copying it and then sending it on to people, but we don't really think that the Gospels themselves had a title. Kata means according to, not necessarily written by. So when you say the Gospel according to Mark, you don't necessarily mean, or the title doesn't necessarily mean the Gospel that was written by Mark. So if one says the Gospel according to John, it's not that John wrote the Gospel of John, but it is a Gospel that has its origin with the apostle, if that's what it means. So they're not necessarily the person who pens the scroll or the document. Evangelion was used in both secular Greek literature and in the Septuagint to suggest God's salvific activity. You can see Isaiah 52:7, 61:1 there. So calling these documents Gospels, the idea of calling them Gospels probably arise because that's how Mark introduces his Gospel, the Gospel according. So that's how it begins. And so with that kind of beginning, then it led to the idea of suggesting that these other ones were also giving their gospel. But there is no literary genre known as Gospels. And so the question becomes, well, what kind of material is this? What genre type is it? So defining the Gospels, well, there's been lots of different attempts at it. Some have called them legendary biographies or memorabilium, that is the presentation of the virtue of its main character. Some have thought of it as a new type of literature or pre-literary. Others have thought of it as biographies or histories and presenting information in some kind of chronological order. Others have seen it as kind of a string of pearls that is really not a genre type. It's just kind of a collection of materials. And so we can't really fit it into one particular kind of work. And others have argued that it's an example of an ancient encomium, which is really a presentation of information so that individuals, the readers, will come to honor or praise the main character or the subject of the work. So several different suggestions, theories have been out there. So looking at these then, one of the common assumptions about the Gospels is that they are acting like some kind of modern biography. So you go to a library and go to and find a biography on some person of history, or you go to booksellers and go to the biography section and you get certain kinds of books that fit into that genre. But they're not really a good classification for what we have in the Gospels. Our Gospel is sketchy or sometimes no descriptions of background information and characters. So, for instance, we're seeing these characters that arise, and very little is given to us in terms of background. So you might think of, the Gospel of Luke has a little bit sketchy background about, John the Baptist, for instance. So find out who his parents are, something about the nature of his birth, but very little is given to us about John. And that just seems to be true for most of the characters. We know very little about their backgrounds, and very little is spent on developing their character or explaining their character. There's no development of the main character's childhood, education. So, for instance, in Mark's gospel, you don't get anything about Jesus as a child. You get nothing about his education. In none of the gospels really do you. Even in Luke, that has one little episode of him going to the temple, we still don't know anything about his education. We don't get into the mind. There's no psychology going on here in terms of getting into their heads. And we don't even really have appearance of them. We don't know what any of these characters look like. No description is given of hair color or eye color, height, complexion of skin. Nothing else is told to us, which would be kind of unusual in a biography. You might get something of a person's personal description. Motivated primarily by theological rather than empirical precision. So it's not so much about getting the chronology exactly right, but it's more about what you are claiming about the main character and what is the author wants people to believe about the main character. So, for instance, I have here as an example Quirinius' census. It is, generally recognized that in Luke's gospel, when it says that Jesus was born during the time of Quirinius' census, we kind of know the general date of that, which is around 6 AD, 6 CE. And so, that does not necessarily fit with Matthew's narrative, and that Jesus was born during the time of Herod the Great. So, you've got two different information. Herod dies around 4 or 5 BCE. So, how do you resolve these two? And it's not so much, Matthew could be more interested in presenting Jesus as a kind of Moses-like figure, and with Jesus being born under Herod the Great and Herod trying to kill him, that makes us think of Moses and how Pharaoh was trying to kill infants. And with Luke, it's important to set Jesus within the context of Roman imperial power. And so that's what a census does. It is a demonstration of imperial power. You can look at the genealogies, particularly like in Matthew's gospel. These genealogies are they're chosen because they fit a particular number scheme. There's certainly not enough names in there to get you from Abraham to Joseph. So it's not a precise genealogy, and there are names that are in there that are kind of uncharacteristic of genealogies, and it looks as if the genealogy is there because it's a point. There's some kind of point that's being made about the character of Jesus, or about Jesus as the fulfillment of a divine plan. And there's also limited access to primary sources. We would expect someone who would do a biography. We would expect somebody doing a biography to get access to primary sources in order to write a credible, reliable historical account. But ancient authors oftentimes don't have access to primary sources, credible primary sources, certainly in a literary form. They may have access to eyewitnesses that they can talk with. There may be some records about things. So they're oftentimes dependent upon kind of oral tradition to create or construct their work. So it's not like a modern biography. They're more like ancient biographies, or what is sometimes referred to as a bios, a life. There are lots of different lives that are written, and Plutarch is a very popular one, and one that has been compared to the Gospels. But German Roman biographies, they start to appear around 44 BCE. So our Gospels are coming at this time when these biographies have been created. They're very flexible in terms of their genres, with different kinds of elements of history. interest and praise of the main characters, often focus on the character of a charismatic teacher or a leader. Like ancient BIOIs, they the Gospels sometimes arrange information chronologically, and sometimes they do it topically. And so also, like ancient BIOIs, the Gospels were primarily written for didactic, that is teaching, or polemical, engaging in some kind of argument with others who have a different view, in this case, the Gospels with Jesus. And so they have those kinds of purposes at work, and that fits what we know about ancient BIOIs. They are also trying to teach and also kind of correct ideas or impressions or thoughts that people may have about the main character. Well, why were all Gospels written? Well, a number of different reasons. Certainly evangelization, persuading readers that Jesus was the Son of God. I don't think that any of the Gospels were written originally for non-believers. Too much is assumed about the story, the narrative, to make sense that this is written for people who've never heard about Jesus and trying to introduce Jesus. Too much is taken for granted to do that. But certainly continuing to persuade readers that Jesus was the Son of God. This is made, I think, a little bit more explicit in the end of John's Gospel, where he tells why. And depending upon the manuscript evidence that you would rely upon for the ending of John's Gospel, it's not so much that you would come to believe, but that you would continue to believe. Also for educational purposes, as said, didactic purposes, exemplary purposes, trying to inform readers about the ethical life that they should pursue, and seeing Jesus as both teaching things and doing things, living in such a way that should inspire and motivate his disciples to do the same thing. You know, Matthew's gospel makes this much more explicit when Jesus, tells his apostles, the disciples at the very end, that they're to go out to make more disciples, and teaching them to observe all that he has taught. So observing what Jesus has taught and what Jesus did, and putting those things into practice. Also, some kind of justification. This is polemic. In other words, they're defending Christian ethics, Christian beliefs, Christian practices. And so by kind of accounting what it is that Christians are doing and explaining in one sense, this is why we do this thing. This is why we live this way. And also for mnemonic purposes. So just preserving memory. So, prior to the writing of the Gospels, of course, the early church depends upon the memories of the eyewitnesses. The Gospels are coming to be written at a time when the first eyewitnesses are dying off. And so to preserve that memory, now, of course, it's not that a written source would immediately be seen as more reliable. These were written during an oral culture, and oral traditions were highly valued. And so what a person says, what the person who's trained in memory work, what they said, what a person taught, may have more credibility than what is actually written. We do have ancient statements that calls into question the writing down of the past, and instead relying, as it were, upon the memory of those who were close to them and who they passed it on to. And there may have been something of a kind of a check and balance with oral tradition memorization. So there's a whole field right now in scholarly work and New Testament and Gospels about memory and how memory functions and the credibility of memory. So as far as I'm concerned, I see memory as a social construct. Memory is not just kind of like a photograph of the past. People remember things because of their importance and significance, and they pass those details in such a way to reemphasize the things that are important. And so this is a thing that is done in the community, not just by an eyewitness of an event. Other reasons why they probably fit into this category as biois, the Gospels have common biographical features, ancient biographical features. Opening features like a prologue or a preface. So, Mark has a very short one. Luke has a much more longer one. John has a very long one. Jesus is most often the verb's main subject. So if you were to look at the main verbs throughout the Gospels, the subject of those main verbs is going to be Jesus. And that's characteristic of an ancient bioi, to be the subject of most of the main verbs. The biois are generally in the same kind of length as our Gospels, somewhere between 10,000 to 25,000 words were the average length for a biography. So Matthew has about 18,000 words. Mark has about 11,000 words. Luke has about 19,000 words, and John has about 15,000 words, 15,500 words. So they are within this kind of range of length and size. And they also use various literary units. So biographies, ancient biographies, uses speeches, stories, dialogues, sayings, as well as a variety of different sources. And that's what we're probably seeing with our Gospels as well. And biois do have authorial intent and purposes. And as I indicated before, our authors probably also have an intent and purpose. And so those features, suggest that they fit into the category of a bioi. Now, Richard Burridge's book, What Are the Gospels, was a landmark work. And here I just want to highlight a couple of things that he says about Greco-Roman biographies and why it's relevant for how we look at our Gospels. Greco-Roman biographers, first of all, people who formed communities around a single charismatic leader typically wrote biographies about them. So that's a customary activity. You have a community, they have a particular leader, someone will write a biography about them. Greco-Roman biographies, GRB, here were written with and for community contexts that needed instruction and differentiations. So, we have 4 Gospels, 4 different, authors, maybe influenced by different communities to write these. And at the time that the Gospel was written, there are lots of different communities of Christians. Pauline Christians and Petrine Christians, Johannine Christians. And so what your people are needing to do is to differentiate themselves from one another, because they see that what some groups may be teaching are not going to be acceptable to other groups. And a gospel helps to present the image of Jesus, or the priorities of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus that are most important to that community. The biois was flexible, adaptive, and it also was a developing genre. So it's not like a checklist. Here's a Roman biographies. It has all of these, 10, 15, 20, aspects to it. And do our Gospels have all 10, 15, 20 aspects? Check off they are. But, different biois have different features. And so we see that our Gospels fit in having some features of one kind of bioi and other features of another bioi. And Gospels also fit into the wide range genres of Greco-Roman biois. And so that wide range genre allows for us to kind of place the biographies or the Gospels into that category. I want to end here just by thinking about what I call the hermeneutical implications of Gospels being bios. So some reasons by looking at this, we need to be reminded of where it takes us. So first of all, Gospels are not unique literary types. So we're not going to read them as if they are somehow or another a distinct kind of genre. So therefore, we interpret them. When we're interpreting them, we try to bear in mind how we would interpret other bios. And so the rules of interpreting bios as a genre are going to be used in interpreting Gospels. We must interpret the Gospel as bios with the same expectations of them as their original audience had. So Matthew's audience, Mark's audience, John's audience, who they wrote for, and it may be true that they also wrote for a wider group of people than just some immediate groups. There's a debate that goes on right now with the work of certain scholars. Richard Bauckham is one of them, who think that the Gospels were written for all Christians. It was intended for a non-specified group, and he calls into questions the assumption of a lot of Gospel scholars that these were written for a particular, and they try to do this thing called mirror reading, where you see things going on in the Gospels and then you extrapolate and think that this is what's going on within the community. So his criticism of this approach is noteworthy and is serious and should be taken seriously. However, I can't imagine that an author writing a gospel doesn't have at least a community in mind, imagining a community that he knows is going to read this, and that this is a community that they are most likely familiar with. So while Matthew may know that Mark's gospel got circulated around and hope that his gospel would get circulated like Mark's did, he does have a community that in mind, who are going through things that he hopes this gospel will help to strengthen, edify, direct. We should not interpret Gospels as if they were a different kind of genre, so we're not going to treat them like they're legal codes, and we're not going to treat them as if they are fiction, but we're treating them as this particular genre type, as bios. And we also need to remember that understanding and emulating the personhood of Jesus is the central literary intention of the Gospels. So to understand who Jesus is, to understand what he did, to understand what he taught, and to put into practice his teachings, to live according to his teaching, that's the central intention of these Gospels. So that'll give you a brief introduction then to the Gospels as bios.